Welcome back. In our last session, we began our discussion of the Passion narrative according to Matthew. As with the other Passion narratives, we followed the general outline of Raymond Brown for the Passion narratives. In particular, we looked at the Gethsemane scene and the arrest scene of Matthew's Gospel, and then moved to a discussion of the Jewish trial and concluded with a discussion of the denial of Peter. In our current session, we continue the discussion of the Passion narrative. We begin with an analysis of the Roman trial scene, or the trial before Pilate. This discussion will include a look at the Barabbas scene, and what that scene contributes to the narrative as a whole. Then we move to the actual crucifixion, beginning with the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of the Cross, and finally, we'll narrate the crucifixion scene and the death of Jesus. After Peter has left the house of the high priest, the Jewish trial or hearing concludes with a decision to send Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. This was necessary because in the climate of Palestine of the first century, there was such upheaval. The Romans had prohibited the Jews from carrying out any sentence of death. When a Jewish court, for example the Sanhedrin, issued a sentence of death, it was then referred to the Roman procurator, who determined whether it was to be executed or not. That's precisely what happens here. Hence, there is need for another hearing taking place rather early in the morning. The chief priests and the elders, in essence the Sanhedrin, who had gathered at the high priest's house, deliberate among themselves and come to the conclusion that the only course of action is to put Jesus to death. But since this is a sentence that cannot be carried out by the Jews, they must now refer it to Pilate. Let's look once again at the map of Jerusalem. The high priest's house, where Jesus currently is marked by this first oval or circle. He's then led to Pilate, who is at the Praetorium for the Jewish feast of Passover. Note, the procurator did not normally stay in Jerusalem. He came for important occasions. And when he stayed at what is known as the Praetorium. There are two possible sites for the Praetorium. The one marked on this map is signified by this second oval. It has been recently put forth by a Benedictine scholar, Bargel Pixner. He concluded that the trial before Pilate took place in the old Hasmonean palace, which was converted to house the Roman procurator. Hence, it was the site of the Praetorium. This map was produced by Father Pixner, and so the Praetorium is so labeled. However, the majority opinion for centuries has been that the Praetorium was located in conjunction with the Fortress Antonia on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, designated by this third oval. That location would allow the procurator a good view of the mount in case any trouble erupted during the feast. Further, the Via Dolorosa, which pilgrims walk to this day, has its origin in the area of what was the Fortress Antonia. That being said, we have here a picture of the beginning of the Via Dolorosa as it exists today. It's marked by a rather large arch, which many have speculated was built from the stones of the original Fortress Antonia. The arch is known as the Ecce Homo arch from the statement of Pilate in the Gospel of John, Ecce Homo, or behold the man. Around the corner from the arch is the entrance to the convent of the Sisters of Zion. The basement of this convent has a rather ancient stone pavement, which was thought to be the pavement on which Pilate judged Jesus, known as the Lithostratos, or stone pavement of John's Gospel. However, Jerome Murphy O'Connor says that archaeologists are not, quote, certain that the pavement cannot date that since the pavement cannot date from the 1st century AD, unquote. As an interlude between the Jewish and Roman trials, Matthew interjects a narrative of the death of Judas. Judas now realizes the full import of what he has done. Jesus is condemned to death. Judas regretted, literally changed his mind about what he had done. The Greek word used is not the normal word for repentance, which is metanoeo, but those funny squiggles there are the verb metamelomai, which is connoted as a change of attitude or regret, not a change of heart, which would be metanoia. That regret causes him to go to the authorities who had hired him and return the 30 pieces of silver that they paid him, admitting Jesus' innocence and his corresponding guilt or sin. But the authorities make light of that and won't take the money back. Basically, a deal's a deal, and what's done is done. So Judas, totally dejected, takes matters into his own hands, flings the money into the temple area, and goes out and hangs himself, the death of a traitor. Now the chief priests have to deal with the money that Judas tossed into the temple. They gather it together, but realize they cannot put it back into the treasury since it was the price of blood. Then they take counsel. The exact word that was used for their decision to put Jesus to death, by the way. And they decide to use the money to buy the potter's field. That can be used for the burial of foreigners, who are not allowed to be buried in the same ground as Jews. Then a note. To this day, that is, to the time of Matthew, it is called the Field of Blood, also known by its Hebrew or Aramaic name, Hakaldama. The text ends with a formula citation from Jeremiah, which is actually a text from Zechariah 11:13. It says, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of a man with a price on his head, a price set by some of the Israelites, and they paid it out for the potter's field, just as the Lord had commanded." Now, how Matthew got from Jeremiah to Zechariah, when he cites this as a rather circuitous journey, which we shall leave alone for now. This is a picture of the area of the southeast end of the Hinnom Valley, where it joins the Kidron Valley, known as Hakaldama. The identification of this spot as Hakaldama, or the Field of Blood, dates from the time of the historian Eusebius. One of the best views of the field is found from the overlook outside the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. The scene of the trial before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate begins very simply. Jesus is brought to stand before the governor, who in turn begins the interrogation, asking, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The question is essentially the same question that the high priest had asked in the Sanhedrin trial. But instead of theological terms, Messiah and Son of God, it's phrased in political terms, King of the Jews. More than likely, this is the charge that the Jewish leaders presented to Pilate. It would be important that they alter their terminology, as Pilate would not be concerned with matters of religion. He's interested only in matters that affect the Roman state. Hence, Jesus' relationship to God would be critical to the Sanhedrin, but not to Pilate. But his possible insurrection, which could be detrimental to Roman rule, would be critical to Pilate. Jesus answers simply, "You say so." In essence, it's neither a yes or a no. Jesus seems to imply that's what you think. So the chief priests and the elders chime in, with a set of accusations more than likely meant to show that Jesus is a revolutionary insurrectionist and a threat to Roman rule. However, Jesus remains silent, unwilling to defend himself against their charges. Jesus' silence here and at the Sanhedrin trial recalls, as we mentioned above, the fourth servant canticle, Isaiah 53:7, where the servant is likened to a lamb led to the slaughter, and he does not open his mouth. So Pilate breaks the silence, asking, "Do you not hear how many things they're testifying against you?" Pilate seems surprised at the non-response of Jesus. But as Hagner notes, Pilate is also aware that this Jesus is no threat to him or his rule. That Jesus refuses to respond to even one of the leader's accusations. This unwillingness to defend himself leaves Pilate in great puzzlement. Matthew then introduces a custom that on the feast of Passover, the governor would release to the leaders a prisoner of their choice. This has come to be known, according to Brown, as the Privilegium Paschale. Now, there's some argument among interpreters whether such a privilege or custom actually existed. It's hinted at in a later Jewish work known as the Mishnah, Tractate Pesach 8:6. In any event, the custom serves a literary purpose in the Passion narrative, which will become clear as we further delve into the unit. Matthew then continues, giving a possible candidate for the release. He's described as notorious, and his name is given as Barabbas, which some manuscripts add the forename of Jesus. Ironically, the Sanhedrin had accused Jesus of being equal to God, calling himself Son of God or Son of the Father. In Aramaic, that would be Bar, son of, Abba, father, hence Barabbas. The prisoner put forth by the leaders and Jesus have a lot in common, at least from the point of view of their name. So now the accusers gather before Pilate, and he invokes his paschal privilege. Which one do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus the Messiah? In essence, which Jesus do they want released? Then Matthew adds a short comment on Pilate. He knew it was out of envy that they had handed Jesus over. Now, Pilate was aware of the leaders' motives, and so he's willing to put it all behind them and release Jesus to them. Hagner puts it well. Pilate had established his own satisfaction with that Jesus had been brought to him, not because he was a genuine threat, or really the promised Jewish Messiah, but because of the Jewish leaders' envy of his influence among the people. Pilate was therefore willing, indeed perhaps inclined, to release Jesus. Now a bit of information that only Matthew provides. Pilate is sitting on the judgment seat, that is, the bema. He's interrupted by a message from his wife. The content of the message is that Pilate is to have nothing to do with that righteous man. This was revealed to Pilate's wife through a dream, which made quite an impression on her. Now, dreams in that first century world were a means whereby the divine communicated with mortal creatures of this world. This dream thus serves as a divine vindication of Jesus, and it confirms what Pilate has been suspecting all along. In the meantime, the chief priests were hard at work among the crowd, spreading the word to ask for Barabbas. They were to utterly destroy the other Jesus. So the governor asks a second time, "Which of these two do you wish me to release to you?" The crowds resoundingly answer Barabbas. With the choice of the people determined, Pilate is now left with another problem. What shall he do with the Jesus that he has left in custody? Jesus the Messiah. The response of the crowd to this question is startling. Let him be crucified. The crowd, clearly influenced by the Jewish leadership, wants Jesus eliminated or killed. But what is startling is the way they want it, in the most gruesome fashion known in that world, crucifixion. This was the mode of capital punishment reserved for the worst of all criminals. This produces yet another query on the part of Pilate. He seems to be somewhat taken aback at their response. So he questioned, what prompted such a punishment? What has this Jesus done? The way the question is phrased does not look to some action on the part of Jesus as worthy of death. It simply asks, is there anything which is worthy of any sort of punishment that Jesus has done? This question gets him nowhere. Rather, the crowd repeats insistently and even more loudly, let him be crucified. Things seem to be deteriorating rapidly unless Pilate does something. The crowd has made up its mind regarding Jesus, and as long as Pilate does not act, they're moving to possible riot. So he realizes he's going to have to yield to the crowd's wishes. But interiorly, he still feels that Jesus is innocent. So he chooses to perform a symbolic action, washing his hands before the people. In that act, Pilate absolves himself of any guilt in his action, but rather places the guilt squarely upon the crowd. See to it yourselves, he says. This shows the literary purpose of the Barabbas scene. By introducing the custom and the choice of the crowd of Barabbas over Jesus, Matthew has literally shifted the blame from the Romans to the Jewish leaders and the crowd that they have put together. The response of the people to Pilate's action is even more startling. Noting that it's not just the crowd gathered now, but the whole people, pas holaos in Greek, who respond, his blood be upon us and upon our children. There is no limit to the distance that they will go to get rid of Jesus. The phrase, blood be upon, is a way of saying we take responsibility for. Harrington notes that the prepositional phrase, upon our children, may serve to link the blood guilt to one generation, that of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem that will take place in about 40 years. Also, the change of word from oklos, crowd, to laos is interesting. Laos refers to the entire Jewish people. Pilate finally accedes to the demands of the whole people, releasing Barabbas to them, and correspondingly delivering Jesus to crucifixion. The scourging here is the first part of the process of crucifixion. The Roman verberatio, which in Roman law demanded always precede the execution of a sentence of capital punishment. This scourging, however, was so brutal that many times the criminal expired during it, or definitely was near the point of death when finally he bore his cross to the place of execution. This is a picture of a six-thonged whip with a wooden handle, which would be used for the scourging. Another type of scourge is pictured here. It was used when the most brutal form of the scourging took place. It had little metal balls and sharp metal fragments meant to inflict maximum injury and pain. So the soldiers take Jesus into the Praetorium, the official residence of the Roman governor in Jerusalem. As we noted above, that could have been located either in the old Hasmonean Palace or the Fortress Antonia, overlooking the Temple Mount. Matthew notes that the whole cohort, approximately 600 soldiers, gathered. That's probably an exaggeration. But the point is, a rather large number of soldiers were involved in this scourging and mocking of Jesus. He had been accused of being king of the Jews, so a king they will make of him. They take his regular clothing and dress him in one of the scarlet robes that the Roman soldiers wore. This was to be his royal robe. And of course, a king cannot be without a crown and a scepter. And so from the thorns that were nearby, they fashioned a crown and put it on Jesus' head, and put a reed into his hand, his right hand. Now the King of the Jews was ready to hold court. So his loyal subjects approached and knelt before him, and in a mocking tone said, "Hail, King of the Jews." Hagner notes that like Caiaphas and Pilate before them, they are unwittingly speaking the truth. But they continued their mocking, spitting upon him, and taking the reed out of his hand and beating him on the head, presumably driving the thorns further into his head. Much of what happens here is reminiscent of the third servant canticle in Isaiah, particularly Isaiah 50, verse 6. When the soldiers had finished having their fun with him, they dressed him in his own garments and led him off to be crucified. This is a reconstruction of what the crown of thorns might have looked like. It's from the Shroud of Turin exhibit at the Notre Dame Center in Jerusalem. As you can see, it's almost like a cap that fits over the entire head. As the soldiers would beat it with a reed, those thorns would drive further and further into the head. Now begins the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of the Cross. Jesus receives his cross as depicted in this mosaic from the basement of the convent of the Sisters of Zion. In actuality, the criminal did not carry the complete cross as depicted here. The upright of the cross, or the uprights of the crosses, were at the place of execution. The condemned would carry the crossbeam over his shoulders and the back of his neck. This would have proved somewhat difficult, especially if they had been significantly weakened during the scourging. That proves to be the case with Jesus. So as they were traveling through the city to the place of crucifixion, they happened upon a Cyrenian, whose name was Simon. This Simon, more than likely, was a pilgrim who was in the city for the Passover celebration. The Roman soldiers in charge of the execution pressed Simon into service as they were allowed to do. There is a later tradition that Simon, a Simon surnamed Niger, in Acts 13:1, who may be this same Simon, became a Christian as a result of this encounter with Jesus. Here we see a picture of the Via Dolorosa as it is in the city of Jerusalem today. A few comments. First, you will note the narrowness of the street. As time went on, the streets were made wider. So you can imagine Jesus attempting to carry the crossbeam of his cross through a narrower street. With the narrowness of the road, the loss of blood, and weakened by the scourging, it's understandable that he fell 3 times in making his way to Golgotha. Today, pilgrims walk that same Via Dolorosa as a part of their pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The streets are usually crowded with people engaged in their everyday routines, just as it was at the time Jesus was crucified. That fact significantly disturbed me the first time I walked the Via Dolorosa, praying the Stations of the Cross. The place of crucifixion had to be located outside the city. Here you see a picture of the Ganath Gate, which led out of the city into the area of Golgotha, as it appears in the model of the city of Jerusalem. When the condemned man reached this point, he was very near the place of his end. The place of crucifixion was known as Golgotha, which means place of the skull, a rather ominous name for an execution site. It's depicted as a small hill in the model of Jerusalem as seen here. This is a picture of what has come to be known as Gordon's Calvary. It's an area just across the street from the Damascus Gate, which was discovered by the British General Charles Gordon in 1883. He recognized the shape of the skull in the hill behind the tomb. One can see the skull if you look very carefully. The cruelty to Jesus continues as the soldiers make the final preparations for the crucifixion. It was customary to offer the condemned person wine mixed with either a grain of frankincense or myrrh to dull the senses and thus the pain. Matthew has the soldiers offer wine mingled with gall. Gall is a bitter herb which can even at times be poisonous. When Jesus tastes the drink, the bitter drink, he senses the soldier's intent and refuses to take it. In fact, the drink is not intended to quench thirst. Rather, that drink will normally intensify thirst. There may be a reference to Psalm 69, verses 20 to 21 in this. Then the soldiers go about their work. Matthew narrates the actual crucifixion in a simple subordinate clause, when they crucified him. Then the attention shifts to the other activities of the soldiers. As was custom for the executing soldiers, they would get the personal property of the executed. And so the soldiers divide the only possessions that he has, his clothing, by casting lots. Unwittingly, this is an almost literal fulfillment of Psalm 22:18, which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Having done all that they were commissioned to do, all that's left is to verify that the condemned has died. So they sit down and keep watch over him until he dies, lest his disciples come and remove him before he dies. As was customary, the charge for which the condemned was being crucified was placed on a titulus over the head. And so, in Jesus' case, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews," it reads in Matthew, so that everyone could see and understand. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. An example of such a titulus is shown here. For those who know the languages, you will see that what is written is different from what I cited. This titulus says, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews," which has given rise to the traditional INRI at the top of crosses from the first letter of each word in Latin. Commentators have noted that this titulus is the only thing that we have about Jesus that's written, yet the four evangelists do not agree with what it says. Here we see two variants. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the upper level, we have the site of Golgotha, which is pictured in the altar here. Pilgrims come from all over to kiss the spot under the altar where Jesus was crucified. Matthew then makes reference to the two robbers who were crucified with Jesus, one on his right and one on his left. even in the last moments of his life, the Jews and the bystanders, or even the ones crucified with him, cannot leave Jesus alone. They continue to taunt him, deriding him, and wagging their heads. Yet another reference to Psalm 22. They bring up again the charge presented to the high priest. You who would destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, save yourself. Let's see how great you are now. Let's see if you really are who you claim to be. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. A final note that the leaders, the chief priests, and the scribes also entered into the mocking. He saved others. He cannot save himself. So, he is the King of Israel? Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe him. Jesus has always preached faith and trust in God. Let him prove his trust in God now, and let God deliver him. Finally, those who were crucified with him also entered into the mocking derision. The final hours are then described quickly. Using the Roman method of determining time, Matthew notes, from the 6th hour, which is 12 p.m. or 12 noon, to the 9th hour, 3 p.m., there was darkness. The notion of the sun not shining in the middle of the day is in the Old Testament a sign of mourning and sorrow, especially in apocalyptic literature. This darkness lasts for 3 hours. Then, at the 9th hour, Jesus cries out in a loud voice. In Hebrew, Mark has it in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the first line of the 22nd Psalm, which speaks of the righteous sufferer who is vindicated and saved by God. The citation of the first line implies that the whole psalm is intended. Matthew places it here to show that even in his total dejection, Jesus still never loses faith in the Father. However, because the Hebrew for my God, Eli, is somewhat similar to the name of the prophet Elijah, Eliah, immediately some of those who are standing by see and think that Jesus is calling Elijah. It was a belief that Elijah was to be the deliverer of those who were in need. And so those looking saw the cry as a plea of Jesus to Elijah to be saved. So, taking pity on Jesus, one of the bystanders runs and took a sponge, soaked it in bitter wine, put it on a reed, and raised it up to Jesus in order that he might drink. But even this gesture of kindness is turned by the crowd into further mockery. Immediately others stop him, saying, "Wait, let us see if Elijah comes to save him." Presumably, they believe that no such thing will happen. Jesus cries out again in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. Thus, in a very simple way, Matthew describes the death of Jesus. Because of the play on the Greek word pneuma, which can mean wind or spirit, this simple phrase can be translated as, he breathed his last.